Gas transport and control of breathing. We're going to begin with how gas is transported through the bloodstream. Oxygen, in particular, is mostly 98% transported bound to a hemoglobin molecule. Each hemoglobin molecule can bind 4 oxygen molecules. In the event that we take hemoglobin and add to it oxygen, we would be left with something called oxyhemoglobin. So, as the PO2 rises, or the partial pressure of oxygen rises, oxygen binds. Remember that we're going to go from an area of high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. If the PO2 falls, or the partial pressure of oxygen falls, oxygen is released. Therefore, we'll bind oxygen in places like the lungs, where the PO2 is high, and will drop off oxygen to the tissues, where the PO2 is low. Oxygen also binds in a neutral pH and in areas that have cooler temperatures, such as the lungs. Oxygen is released in areas of low pH or acidic pHs in warm temperatures, such as the tissues. Muscle is a really good example. You might have some lactic acid fermentation as a result of muscle use, and in addition, heat is created by muscle contraction. Therefore, the temperature might be a little bit warmer in the tissue. Only about 2% of oxygen is actually traveling in the bloodstream dissolved in the plasma. Taking a look here, you can see the 2% dissolved in the plasma, but the majority of it is actually traveling on a red blood cell as oxyhemoglobin. Carbon dioxide transport is a little bit more involved. About 10% of it can in fact be dissolved in the plasma. Some of it can actually be bound to hemoglobin, in which case we would call it carbaminohemoglobin. In this case, we would take a hemoglobin molecule, bind to it carbon dioxide, and get the carbaminohemoglobin. In this case, CO2 binds to globin, whereas oxygen binds to the heme portion. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are not competing for binding spots on a hemoglobin molecule. However, the overwhelming majority of carbon dioxide is transported in the bloodstream as bicarbonate. The equation looks something like this. Carbon dioxide plus water is going to yield carbonic acid. That will dissociate almost immediately into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So the HCO3 negative is your bicarbonate. It is catalyzed by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. And remember, anything ending in ASE indicates that it's an enzyme. Most bicarbonate then is dissolved in the plasma. Hydrogen ions that bind to hemoglobin are going to cause oxygen to be released, which is fine because it's usually going to be in an environment where we have an acidic pH anyhow. That lowers the pH, ensures oxygen transport to the tissues. In this picture, you can see the 10% dissolved in the plasma. You can also see some of it combining with the hemoglobin to give you the carbaminohemoglobin. The overwhelming majority, however, we talked about having carbon dioxide plus water forming carbonic acid and then dissociating almost immediately into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. That bicarbonate then diffuses into the plasma and travels that way. In the lungs, here's what happens. The equation gets reversed. So we take our bicarbonate plus hydrogen ions. That's going to form our carbonic acid, and then that will dissociate into carbon dioxide and water. So two of the things that you're exhaling out of your lungs are carbon dioxide and water. CO2 is exhaled and the pH approaches neutral. Again, just showing you that most of the bicarbonate is most of the carbon dioxide is being transported as our bicarbonate. And then if you were to reverse the reaction, you would be releasing the CO2 in the water. Control of breathing. Your body has a normal breathing rhythm, which is basically your tidal volume. This is controlled by the brainstem or the medulla oblongata. Inside the medulla oblongata, you have your respiratory centers. Every 4 or 5 seconds, a signal is sent to the muscles for inspiration, and you would start to breathe. Now, as far as the control of this goes, there's some chemical receptors that recognize the different chemical compositions of the bloodstream. Changes in carbon dioxide levels are recognized as hydrogen ions in the central nervous system. This is back to that way that carbon dioxide transports itself inside the bloodstream as bicarbonate, because here's the equation. Carbon dioxide plus water yields carbonic acid, which dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. Remember that the hydrogen ion concentration is going to give us a measure of pH. So, when the PCO2 rises, the concentration of hydrogen ions rise inside the cerebral spinal fluid. The receptor cells recognize the hydrogen ion concentration. This causes you to breathe more frequently and deeper. That will rid the body of CO2 and force the reaction back to the left. So if you look at the equation in A, if you were to breathe faster, the arrows would be reversed, and you would be exhaling that CO2 and the water and getting rid of the hydrogen ions and getting the pH back to normal. There's also a chemical receptor that will recognize a drop in the partial pressure of oxygen, but this is only secondary to the carbon dioxide levels, and you have to have a significant drop in oxygen. So 20% or more of a drop in oxygen is going to cause the carotid and the aortic bodies, being the receptor, so again, inside the carotid arteries and the aorta. They will also cause an increase in breathing rate and depth because, of course, what we need is to get more oxygen into the bloodstream. So regardless of whether we have too much CO2 or not enough oxygen, our result is the same. We increase the breathing rate and we increase the breathing depth. This picture just kind of shows some of the control here. The medulla oblongata is going to be recognizing some of the changes in chemicals here. It's going to recognize our hydrogen ion concentration as a result of increased CO2 levels. We also have the receptor cells you can see in the carotid arteries and in the aorta responding to oxygen concentrations. And then we have some higher centers in the brain that will cause a conscious override of respiration, indicating that we would increase our breathing rate and depth.